Okay, hello everybody. Let's talk a little bit more about the Mexican Revolution. We're largely going to focus on how this impacts migration, largely out of Mexico. It's probably not a surprise to you that the Mexican Revolution, something that was responsible for the deaths of 1.5 million people in Mexico, is going to be a huge push factor. Many people are going to want to leave in search of a better quality of life, in search of more economic opportunities, etc. Also, since you're stuck with me as a teacher, you get to learn a little bit of US history here on the side. But I promise you it's going to help you for 11th grade if you especially if you want to take A push, which is super content dense. But let's talk about this and then let's get on with our weekend, shall we? So, in any event, it's important for us to acknowledge that this is literally written here, so let's not beat a dead horse. But this is one of the reasons why there's a huge exodus from Mexico, this political turmoil. Um, and then this just highlights some of the push factors. This video is going to be really short now that I think about it, but it's okay. Um, so, because Diaz sponsored so much more foreign investment, like we already said, the landless peasants don't really have that many economic prospects anymore. So many of them decide to just leave the country. Some of them become migrant workers in the United States. This does not mean they have any political or citizenship rights, but they did find more economic opportunities in some instances, especially in the rural South close to the Mexican and American border. Again, we talked about the fatalities. That's going to be a huge push factor. And just like we were saying, there are a lot of economic opportunities in the American Southwest. It's not just about agriculture, it's also about things like mining jobs and also laying railroad tracks on rather the rapidly expanding American West. Okay, and another thing that's interesting, and this is where we'll move on, U.S. immigration policies take a major turn in the decade or so after World War One. It's important for you guys to already know, this is a sidebar, but this isn't the first time that the United States restricted the flow of immigrants into the United States. They also did that in 1882 with regard to the Chinese population that was settling in the American West. There was a lot of nativist sentiment. Nativism means anti-immigrant. And so in 1882, the US already restricted immigration from China with something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. But we're going to see how this impacts groups coming from other parts of the world as well. By no means do I want to read this, but one of the first important acts of legislation in US immigration policy in the years after World War I was the 1917 Immigration Act. So instead of me reading these out loud, I want you to just pause and look at this. This is literally the language of this act. So that gives you a sense of how progressive the US government was with regard to immigration in 1917. Calling them things like idiots, imbeciles. You could compare that to some of the language that is used that's directed towards immigrants, especially the language that some leaders in government use. Even the most conservative leaders in American politics would probably not use most of these terms. But I'm not saying that there aren't some leaders that do use some terms that one could argue are problematic. But let's not jump down that rabbit hole today. Let's just focus on this. Another thing, I don't know if it's in the slides. Unfortunately, it's not. But let me just quickly talk about a 1924 act called the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. What this did was it actually set quotas for how many people could immigrate into the United States from different countries. What this act clearly did was it placed a priority on immigrants from Western and Northern Europe, places like the United Kingdom, well, it wasn't the United Kingdom at that point, but places like the British Isles, places like Germany. Eventually, you will see a flow of immigrants from places like Italy and where I'm Eastern Europe, places like Poland. But in the early years after World War One, the United States was even hesitant to welcome immigrants from Eastern Europe because they were still in this first Red Scare when the Russian Revolution also took place during World War One. There was definitely this fear that countries in Eastern Europe might recruit communists to migrate into the United States. There was also a literacy test on immigrants, which is really interesting. You had to be able to, then this is not the US citizenship, This is just a test to allow immigrants to then settle in the United States. They had to be able to read so many words. This didn't have to be in English, but it's an interesting stipulation to potentially curb the flow, rather, of immigrants. But what's really interesting about all this is that Mexicans actually were exempted from these policies. And one of the reasons why that was because the U.S. found a very cheap source of labor from the Mexican population. And since they shared a border, a 7,000 plus mile border, it would be difficult for the U.S. to really enforce a border patrol or a border policy so early in the 19 teens. The U.S. didn't really have the manpower to do that in the way that the government can now with the expansion of the U.S. government, with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security that houses something like ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Okay, but I'm going way ahead. This is the last slide. I just want you guys to look at this chart and think about what policies I just talked about. The 1917 one written down here and the 1924 one that I mentioned out loud. So let's find 1917. You see this spike of immigrants from Mexico, which seems to be counterintuitive because of this policy that we just talked about. But remember that I just said that Mexicans were not beholden to this policy. So as immigration from other parts of the world were restricted because of this act, you actually see more Mexican people immigrating to the US. And this also, of course, is coupled with the violence and political instability from the Mexican Revolution, which wasn't over by 1920. And then if we move forward to 1924, you actually see a steep plummet, just briefly, of Mexicans immigrating to the United States. Some of this was because of the economic boom in the United States in the 20s. You're going to see that in general there were more opportunities for American citizens than there were for immigrants. But then you see towards the end of the 1920s, as we are moving closer to the Great Depression, there is again a spike of Mexican immigrants because there are a lot of economic opportunities in the late 1920s before the market crashed. And then after the market crash, you will see it plummet yet again. And that's going to be the focus of our classes early next week, is what happens during the Great Depression with regard to migration and what happens during World War II with regard to migration. So maybe you could make some predictions on your own, and that will be a really cool way to think ahead leading into the content of next week. So I hope, again, all these will be helpful for you. It's even more important to watch these, quite frankly, now that we've moved on to distance learning. So please check these out. You are accountable for the content on these last 3 videos, including this one, because now we're into the Mexican Revolution. So these are also a good study tool for an upcoming quiz. So let's leave it at that. Have a great weekend, all of you. Definitely rest, relax, be good to yourself, stay healthy, and I'll see you soon. Thanks a lot.